From Boca Raton, Florida, this is Behind the Bima. On this episode, a powerful father and son duo who've made an indelible mark on both the Jewish community and the broader cultural landscape. Rabbi Goldberg sits down with the one and only Ben Shapiro and his father David Shapiro in an intimate, heartfelt conversation that explores everything from Ben's path into political commentary to the profound impact of David's musical genius on his son's life and career. The Shapiros take us behind the scenes of their remarkable collaboration on the new musical We Will Rise, a stirring production spotlighting the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that moved Israeli audiences to tears and ignited renewed hope in challenging times. Discover how a shared love of learning, faith, and the power of music forged an unbreakable bond between father and son, and glean parenting insights from David on raising a child who not only sits at your side in synagogue, but partners with you on grand creative endeavors. All this and more, Behind the Bima.
Wow, what a privilege. How exciting to go behind the Bima. Ben, welcome back behind the Bima. And Mr. Shapiro, David, thank you for joining us behind the Bima to talk about this amazing collaboration, the musical that took Israel, I would say, by storm, but that had enormous impact, inspiring. We Will Rise, which I know showed, I believe there were 8 showings of it in Israel, maybe Israel's largest theatrical production, really extraordinary. I read the reviews, I heard from people who were there, and I had the privilege. Mr. Shapiro, you came over to our home and you played some of that music for us, for me, my wife, and our children, and we were just blown away. Without even the theater, just the music itself is enough to stir you and to move you, which is amazing. So Ben, let's start with this: a collaboration, a collaborative project. You know, a lot of people with their dads, they can't even install something in their home. They can't even get along to figure out how to drive to the game. And here, you and your dad collaborated on this enormous project. What does that mean to you, that watching your dad's musical prowess, musical acumen your whole life, to see this production go live, to see the impact it's having, to be able to collaborate on this project? What does it mean to you?
I mean, it's an amazing thing. I mean, so my father and I are amazingly close. We've always been really, really close. From the time I was a kid to, when we got married, we lived in Mount for my parents. When we moved here, my parents moved at the same exact time. When we visited to think about moving, they were on the same plane. We shared the same moving truck. So, obviously there was not really a conflict of visions, so to speak. And my father and I have worked together for a long time in a wide variety of different contexts. So it wasn't really an issue in terms of how to work together. I think the pleasure of this project was being able to see my dad's vision come to fruition. So his music is tremendous. And then the music and the work that he did on the lyrics, he did the music and the lyrics. I did the libretto, meaning the plot, the script for the show. His work on this is really extraordinary. And, having grown up in a house where I felt like, his talent was underappreciated by the world. I mean, I grew up in a house where he wanted to write for film and TV in Hollywood. And most people who want to do that never actually get the chance to do that in any real way. And he wasn't really an exception in Hollywood. Being able to actually present with a full orchestra, with a full cast, not only a musical that features some tremendous music and tremendous lyrics, but also one that's so meaningful spiritually, religiously, historically. It's an amazing thing. And I think that, it's a tremendous tribute to my father's talent.
And it couldn't come at a better time. The story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the survival of the Jewish people, the resiliency, the tenacity of our people, October 7th. And it really is like a soothing salve on the open wound of the Jewish people over this last year and a half. And I know that's the way that people received it. And we'll get into the actual musical in a moment. But Mr. Shapiro, how do you raise a son who wants to sit next to you in shul? Many of us have young children. We can't get them to sit next to us. One of the most beautiful things to see when you were trying out the community and since then several times, to see the two of you sit in shul next to each other and to see the closeness that you have with one another. How do you raise children? How do you raise a son who wants to be so close, who shares that moving truck and shares his life in that way? Give some parenting tips to us for a moment before we even get into the music.
Oh, gosh. Well, yeah, Ben and I have talked about this for years. I was lucky enough to marry the right girl, number one, because we met when we were 18 and I proposed to her 2 days after we met, and now it's 50 years later. So she's an exceptional woman. So that is the first step. But I also, it was said very often that one unspoken rule, it was a tacit rule that my wife and I both had, which was that we always took our children seriously. So whenever they had questions, we never dismissed them. We figured, it made parents sometimes think that it's not important to them, therefore it's not, how important can it be? It's vital to the child at the moment. And so we always took them really seriously. I was also conscious of my own shortcomings in many ways, in all sorts of ways. Certainly intellectually, there are certain things I know very well, a few things, but most things I don't. And so when I would have friends over, like for a Shabbos meal, he always sat on my right, and my friends would sit on my left, and I would encourage them to have a conversation. So because they were erudite about subjects that I knew very little about. And so he was imbibing all this knowledge from the beginning. He also had a tremendous thirst for knowledge. So I think that's a lot of it. And the other part of it is just always having his back. There are all sorts of stories we could tell, but the bottom line is that Ben always knew that wherever he went, whatever he did, I was always there to pick up the slack, and he could depend on that. And then I think that's probably most of it.
The relationship, like I say, is special, and I think it's something we all hope for and want to have ourselves. And this collaboration, maybe professionally, is an expression of it. So, Mr. Shapiro, when did you start playing music, and when did you know that you were musical? Not just playing music, but also your pitch, key, and your ability to compose, which is next level.
Well, my older sister, Allah Shalom, she died of cancer 29 years ago. She was brilliant. She was the oldest. I was the second of 4 children. And she took piano lessons. And when she was 6, and when she was 8, I said, I want to take piano lessons too. And in 2 or 3 months, I had done what she had done in 2 years. And it's the only thing that I could ever do better than my sister, who was far more bright than I was, and far more, just a really gifted individual. So I knew that there was something going on. It just came naturally to me. The funny thing is, I've told people that when I was 6, I remember we used to have those big, stereo units where you'd have a radio on one side and a record player on the other. And I would be listening. My mom loved musicals, so I was listening to Carousel with John Raitt, the original recording. And I remember being 6 years old and thinking, I want to write something like that someday. So along the way, I wrote a couple musicals. They never came to fruition like this one. And I wondered why. But I should have known God always has a better plan. And what God was waiting for was for Ben to be a certain age, where Ben had this brilliant idea of writing about the Warsaw Ghetto. He said, Dad, let's do that. And he wanted me to write it with Ben. And the truth is, there's no better collaborator. I've said to people very often that we think the same thoughts, but it's like a spiral. So I'm here on the circle, and if you go up like this, he's in the same place in the circle, but he's just here. So we can communicate very easily. And there are not a lot of long conversations because we understand each other so well. So that made it easier.
And the music it's a piece of your soul. When you played it for us, and when we heard it, it wasn't just you were playing, isn't this a catchy song you're listening to, or isn't this a moving or stirring song? You saw in your expressions and your demeanor that it was a piece of you. It came from inside you. You were expressing something, and music expresses something that words can't. So Ben, you're a master of words. You've made a career, and you're standing up and advocating for our people and for Israel in ways we continue to be grateful for. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you again for doing it at personal risk and selflessly. And it's not always easy. We're incredibly grateful for it, but you're a master of words. And that's how you communicate. And that's what you've built, not only your career, but that's also what your passion is. And music is without words. So what does music mean to you as a form of communication without words? And I was thinking, I know that there are videos of you playing violin, and you played, and you might have even gone very far with that had you continued on that path. You speak so quickly, right? That's the joke everybody has about how fast that you speak. How do you have the patience to play the music slowly?
So it was a problem. It was a problem when I was practicing. I used to have to put a metronome on because I tended to play the pieces a little bit too fast. So that actually doesn't change even whether you're performing music or whether you're talking. But I think that one of the things about moving into a genre like musical theater is exactly the recognition that you're talking about. The basic theory, I think, of musical theater is that the song breaks out when the words can go only so far. You can't go any further with the words. You can't go any further with dialogue. And now you need to express this in music. And I'm pretty famous for not being a feelings guy, or I in fact don't care about your feelings and all of that. But the reality is that when you're talking about a theatrical genre or a fiction genre, the whole point is to access people's feeling through story. And you can do that in 2 ways. One, you can draw some colorful and interesting characters. I think that we've done that with this musical. But the other way to do that is to really reach deeper to a more primal place. And that's what I think the music does. There are several numbers, several songs in this musical that I think, really dig deep emotionally and are both dramatic and effective. And some of the reactions that we saw in Israel were pretty incredible. we had the ability to meet some people who had lost children in this war, who saw that the show, it's pretty openly a tribute to soldiers who were lost in this war. Some of them, the one of the final images of the show is a backdrop of the pictures of all the soldiers who have fallen in this latest war. So there were parents of some of those soldiers in the audience at some point while people were singing the final song, while the cast was singing the final song, which is all about rising from the ashes of the Holocaust to build something new, rising from the worst possible situations in order to defend the Jewish people, defend civilization. And that's really moving stuff. And I think only music can do that.
Okay, Ben, so I just want to get for the record, right? Facts don't care about your feelings. You're a rationalist fact guy, but Ben Shapiro does have feelings. Do we get that for the record?
I do. It wrecks my brand if I talk too much about it. So we should just leave it at that.
And music is the way to those feelings. Music moves you and then stirs something in you. Exactly. Those pieces, when you play them for us, they build, they take you to this place. There's no question about it. So why the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Mr. Shapiro? Why is that the historical event? Why is that the focus?
Well, I should probably let Ben answer that, because what happened was he came up with the idea of something that he's been fascinated by. It's something I've certainly been interested in, but he's been fascinated by it. So I think he'd probably be more articulate about why once he said it, I remember reading Mila 18 back when I was about 12, which is 57 years ago. And it's sticking with me. So I was always moved by everything I've seen about it, but Ben was the one who really had the passion to write it about it. And then once he communicated it to me and he wrote the libretto, then I was off and running.
So then why the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? What does that story summarize for you? What does it symbolize or represent that is so important to retell right now in 2025?
So the truth is, we started writing this musical based on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 2021.
We finished it in 2019.
Oh, yeah, okay. So the original version was 2019. So that was, with an eye toward the sort of chaos that had been building up in Israel, a lot of the internal divisions that were happening in Israel. But I think mostly it was just because if you're talking about a story of heroism in the face of tremendous risk and tragedy, you're not going to do better than the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is a reminder of unity. It's a reminder that, as Rav Soloveitchik said, that there's a covenant of fate and covenants of destiny. Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is really about how you transform the covenant of fate. And there's no more, better example of the covenant of fate. Basically, no matter how you're born, no matter what situation you are, no matter what you think, you end up in the same ghetto with everybody else, and transforming that into a sense of purpose and mission. And so that was always, I think, important and fascinating. And then it became obviously significantly more important after October 7th. So we've been ready to go with the show actually in 2023, earlier 2023. We'd already been talking about launching it in Israel. After October 7th, we added the beginning and the end of the show. The show now opens with two soldiers in Kfar Aza going through the ashes of the homes there and finding a picture of one of the soldiers' grandmother when she was a baby in the ashes, and she's been kidnapped into Gaza. And then we flash into the picture and we're now in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And the idea of the musical is that the battle is always the same. The battle is always with people who are exterminationists and eliminationists. And the question is, can you get it together to fight those people? And I think that not only is that a Zionist message, I think that's a civilizational message. There are always people who want to destroy civilized people. There are always people who want to destroy those who wish to live and thrive. And the question is, can you get it together? Can you move past whatever internal divisions you have in order to recognize the presence of a larger outside threat? Obviously, on a very practical and sort of pragmatic level, that's exactly what Israel's been going through for the last year. But I think that's what Israel's been going through since before the creation of the state of Israel.
There's no question. The truth is, Yom HaShoah, that we think of as Holocaust Memorial Day, I know it was just International Holocaust Memorial Day. Yom HaShoah is really called Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, and the day was chosen for it to represent the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, because not just this passive, fatalistic victim mentality, but also when we were empowered. And one of the few examples during the Holocaust, like you say, where we were able to unite and be able to put together that revolt. So Ben, October 7th, the Jewish world came together. October 6th, we were on the brink of a civil war. October 7th, we had some unity, we came together. It feels a little bit like we're heading back towards October 6th instead of being the October 8th Jews that are united, whether it's agreements and disagreements over the ceasefire and the hostage deal, whether it's political coalitions that are under pressure and might fall apart, whether it's debate about what should happen post the war. How do we maintain that unity? How do we not need an uprising or our enemies to unite us? But what are you seeing, and what do you feel are the things that we can be doing?
So, I mean, I think the truth is that when you spend time in Israel, and I've gotten the chance to spend several months in Israel since October 7th. We were back in the summer, and then we were back again in November for the premiere of the musical. And when you're there, the thing that you recognize that the political system is failing the people. The people of Israel are significantly more united than the political system is. The political system is incredibly fragmentary. The headlines that you read are about party battles and coalitions. But if you ask the normal Chiloni guy from Tel Aviv, and you ask the normal guy from the Shtachim about what the future of Israel should look like, there's actually pretty broad agreement on, I think, the major points. As I've said before, I think there's 70% agreement in Israel on the three major issues of the day. One, should Israel deregulate its economy and strengthen it? Yes. Two, should everybody serve in the army? Yes. Three, should Israel take a much stronger, more independent stance with regard to its own foreign policy, which includes a recognition that there cannot be a Palestinian state? Yes. I mean, all three of those issues are actually not particularly controversial. It's just that they cross-cut all of the various parties. And so it's very difficult to get a coalition together that actually agrees on all three of those issues. Right now, the government that you have in power agrees on two of those three issues, but not on, for example, serving in the military being a universal mandate. And then if you had a left-wing coalition, it would agree on two of the three issues. It might agree on some deregulation of the economy, but it wouldn't necessarily agree on taking an aggressive foreign policy stance. And so the sort of failure of the political system to adjust for the new reality on the ground for most Israelis is a failure of the political system. And I think that we should point that out, just because it's not a failure of the people, right? I think that a lot of the unity that was there is still there. And you see it when you're talking with people. It's just not being reflected by the headlines. It's not being reflected in the news. And again, I'm in the news business, is what I do for a living. And it's very easy to think that sort of the news headlines reflect the feeling on the ground. But I'm not sure I've ever seen a situation where there's been more of a disconnect between the headlines coming from Israel and the actual sentiment on the ground in Israel from the people.
Which is why it's so important to get over there, live it, feel it, see it yourself, and not believe in or trust the headlines. No offense to the people in that business. So, Mr. Shapiro, you've been back in Israel. You launched the musical.
Yep.
What kind of reaction did you get? What was the response to it? Did it
amazing
score that you were hoping for?
There were some amazing stories. I mean, there's a gentleman that I met that we all know, actually, who comes here periodically to raise funds for something. And he had lost his son in Gaza, I think in June. And I met him coming out of shul one day here. I didn't know him, so we introduced ourselves. And he told me he lost his son. And then when we got to Israel, he found out about the show, and he came to see the show. And he sent me a text later that night. And he said, I have not been out of the house with my wife for 5 months since my son was killed. We decided to come see the show. And then we came to the show. And as Ben was saying, at the very end of the show, when they're singing this heroic song about the eternal nature of the Jewish people, you see in the back the screen, and one by one, all the soldiers that we've lost in the war pop up. And he looked up and he saw his son. And he said he felt his son was saying, Abba, that he was smiling down on, he was smiling in the picture, smiling down and saying, I wanted you to come. I wanted you to get out of the house. I wanted you to have your life back. Yeah. There were a number of stories like that. There's another story where Ben we did 2 performances in Jerusalem. The 4th performance and the 7th one. And Ben gave a speech before the 4th one, but he wasn't in time for the 7th one. So I did. So I gave a speech before the show, and then I went back to my seat. So people knew, where I was, who I was. And at intermission, this very elderly woman came over to me and said, you're the composer lyricist? I said, yeah. She said, and the much of the musical is about Mordecai. He's not the main character, but Mordecai Analevich, who of course led the revolt. And she said, she's 98 years old. She said, I was with Analevich in Warsaw. I was 15 years old. I was the messenger for the group. And she was so moved by it. And she said after the show, she paid us quite a compliment. She said, I've seen a lot of Holocaust shows in my life. This is the first one that felt really authentic to me, like I was reliving having been there. And she was just so glad we had paid tribute to Analevich. I've said to people, somebody asked me after, this is digressing for a moment, but people asked me what I was going to write next. And I said, I'll never write another musical again. I've written a couple before this. I'm never going to write another one again, because I'll never write anything as good as this again, because I'll never care about anything as much as I cared about this. And, as any human being, the more you care about something, the better your work is. So I'll never care as much about this love letter as anything, as much as I do this love letter to the Jewish people and specifically the people of Israel. So I know well enough to know not to go there. It's I've already done the best I'll do.
And October 7th really, as you said, it changed the musical, and the musical would have just been a tragic one, right? The attempt of the uprising, but unfortunately was unsuccessful. And it was in the context of this historic genocide against our people. And it would have been hopeful, but ultimately sad in the October 7th message and the notion of surviving and fighting, and that we will rise. But more than we will rise, we are rising. And we're seeing that, right? Having pushed back on 7 fronts in this war, having decimated Hezbollah and Hamas in ways that certainly before nobody thought was possible. We're seeing what Ben and I might debate this, but what I think are miracles in our time. There are revealed miracles and hidden miracles, and even if they're explainable, whether it's the pagers or the ways that we've defeated and taken out Iran's missile defense or being protected from hundreds of ballistic missiles, even though they're explainable in the natural order, but the unlikelihood of it and the lack of it being predicted, I think, borders on a miracle. Certainly enough for us to be able to say thank you and appreciate God. I don't mean to presuppose you'll debate me on that. Maybe you would agree that there are miracles that we should be appreciative of. So it's not just that we will rise. This isn't some passive, we're waiting for Mashiach, and when he comes, finally we'll defend our people. I know the two of you very much believe that we are rising and we must rise, and we are pushing back. So, Ben, I'll ask you in that context, this ceasefire, and obviously you've spoken a lot about it on your show, and you have a lot of insight on it. For some people, it's a necessary pause, and it's a necessary extortion that we've allowed ourselves to do, because there's no other way to bring the hostages home, and they need to be home. Others feel that it's a concession, and we're giving in when we have the upper hand, and we're not rising, we're not displaying our strength when we should close them out and decimate them. Where do you see this pause we are right now within this war? There were some headlines yesterday that they're already preparing to continue the war, and there's not a lot of hope that the second phase will take place. There was a headline today that I saw that the tens of thousands who came back to the north yesterday actually turned around and are heading back south and are saying, please relocate us. There's nowhere to go home to. We want to. So is this a pause in the war? Will the war continue? Is it an expression of rising, a willingness to pause? Sometimes it makes more strength to stop than it is to continue.
I mean, the only way to really determine whether or not the deal is good or not is what happens next. The only good parts of the deal would be things that are not in the deal, is the way that I'd put it. The deal itself is trash, but it also might be the best deal available. Both of those things are not mutually exclusive. It turns out that freeing literally 1,000 terrorists in favor of a few Israeli hostages is, by any stretch of the imagination, an awful deal that will result in more dead Israelis. There's no question that not only will more Israelis be taken and kidnapped because of stuff like this, is true of Gilad Shalit as well. It means that many of these people who are currently being freed to Qatar and Turkey are going to make their way back into Judea, Samaria, Gaza, and they're going to kill Jews again, because that's always what happens. With that said, obviously it's of high priority to the Israelis to get their people back, and trying to bring back those people, even at that high cost, may be something worthwhile, since it's probably the last best opportunity. The thing that President Trump was willing to do that Joe Biden was not, was to basically say to the Israelis, this isn't the end of the war. You can go back in if you need to go back in. And to say to Hamas, it's not going to get better for you from here. It's only going to get worse for you from here if you turn down the deal. Neither of those things were things that Joe Biden was willing to say, which is why you end up with this deal. And again, do I think that all sides could have pushed harder to get more hostages out? I do. Do I think that Israel has finished the job in the Gaza Strip? I don't, nor do I think that Bibi thinks that, or that the Israeli government thinks that. And what comes next in Gaza, no one really knows the answer to that. And certainly leaving Egypt and Qatar in charge of Gaza would be a fool's errand and an idiotic idea. So yeah, I would be shocked if this deal reaches phase 2. If it turns into a quote unquote permanent ceasefire without any real framework for operations on the ground, then obviously that would be a gigantic failure by the Israeli political establishment, because what the IDF actually performed in Gaza was a near miraculous feat of arms. To go into a heavily urban area, have essentially a terrorist to civilian kill ratio of 1-to-1 in that area. Well, yes, losing too many soldiers, but losing a bare fraction of the number of soldiers that Hamas lost, fighters and terrorist associates in this war. To then leave control of Hamas, of Gaza back to Hamas at the end of that would be a terrible loss. I don't think that that's Bibi's intent. I think Bibi knows that can't be his intent. The government will fall if that's Bibi's intent. And so, yeah, again, it's hard to assess the deal until you know what comes next. All I will say is I have yet to see a Middle Eastern quote unquote agreement that ever reaches phase 2. There has never been a phase 2 in any of these agreements. Oslo never really reached phase 2. A ceasefire agreement with Lebanon will not reach phase 2. There's never a phase 2. There's either phase 2 hasn't even been negotiated here. I mean, it's extraordinarily vague. So I think that everyone can hold all these conflicting emotions at once. Everybody's very happy to see the hostages home. We should be happy to see the hostages home. Everybody is devastated to see Israel give up control over militarily necessary areas like the Netzarim corridor. They should be very unhappy about that. Everybody should be very unhappy about watching murderers, actual abject child, women, entire families, murderers being released back to Qatar and Turkey. That is an act of tremendous horror. I mean, I know people who whose relatives were killed by people who are now being released, and every one of those lives is worth just as much as any other life. And so, I think that we can have all of these mixed feelings without suggesting, number one, that there was an easy solution, which I think there was too much demagoguing of this entire thing from the beginning. This idea that there was an easy solution, that if only Bibi had done X, Y, or Z, then the hostages would have come out sooner. Or if only Bibi had been more self-sacrificial. Or now, if Bibi were only harder. These are literally impossible decisions. And the minute that Israel decided to want its hostages back, there was always going to be a bad result at the end of a hostage deal, because any hostage deal is in and of itself a bad result.
Yeah, the choices were between bad and worse. There was no good option here. And 100% it's devastating. I think about it in the context of Pesach. We eat the Hillel sandwich on Pesach, the matzah and maror together, because sometimes there's freedom and there's bitterness at the same time. And like you described, this is really one of those Hillel sandwich moments, that there is the joy of the freedom for the hostages, but the bitterness of what was given up. I think one of the things that was missing that I know I haven't seen, maybe you have, is the alternative. I haven't heard anyone articulate, here's what would signify the war's end. Here's what victory looks like. Here's what should happen afterwards. And either it's unclear to everyone, or the government doesn't want to play its hand, or no one's unsure what that looks like. And in the absence of that, I think is a lot of debate over whether this was right or wrong. But you have people who are highly critical, but you don't hear a lot of alternative definition of victory or description of what should happen. Hamas is rearming. It's an ideology, not a country. It's not like in World War where people surrender and then you negotiate the terms of the surrender. It's an ideology that will never surrender. So how do you define defeating them? And sometimes it takes more strength to press the pause, to regroup than it would to keep going if there is no clear end in sight. I don't know if you've seen anyone.
Look, I have significant disagreements with the very basis of hostage deals in general. I think that the entire framework with which we think about this sort of stuff is deeply flawed. The minute you say to your enemy that if you take hostages, you have the ability to win the war on your terms, or even get your terms, all you're doing is leading to a massive incentive for terrorists to take hostages in the future. We all know this. We all know this. And eventually that math is going to have to stop. It will, because otherwise people will just keep getting kidnapped. And what price is going to be considered too much? As far as what the end of the war looks like, I mean, to me, it had always been the reality, but nobody was willing to say it out loud, that Israel was going to have to retain military control of the Gaza Strip. I mean, there was just no other alternative. Leave it. Who's going to do it? Egypt, Qatar, UAE, Saudi? None of them want. No.
Or Mahmoud Abbas, who calls to congratulate the freedom of one of the terrorists.
It seemed to me that always the most practical solution was going to end up being something like what Israel has in Jenin or Nablus, which is essentially security control of the area with transparency by units like Duvdevan, and allow them to go in and perform military activities in these particular areas, and some semblance of domestic rule for somebody to pick up the garbage. Like that'd be the best case scenario for the Gaza Strip. But again, that would require a willingness to say the thing, which is that there are going to be Israeli soldiers in that area probably for the rest of time, and that there will be Israeli soldiers who die in that area for the rest of time, just like there are Israeli soldiers who unfortunately are killed in Nablus and Jenin every year. These are, again, there are no great answers here. As far as hitting the pause button, I think the logic is if you can get people out before you have to finish the job the way that I'm talking about, then get people out. And I think that that's probably the logic of the government here. What it looks like when they unhit the pause button, there may never be a quote unquote formal unhitting of the pause button. It might not be that the Israeli government says, okay, now the deal's over, we're going back in. It might just be these sort of soft operations without ever acknowledging that that's what's happening. I mean, that sort of stuff happens all the time in the Middle East. I mean, right now, Israel is supposed to be at the end of a ceasefire in Lebanon, and Israel has retained forces in Lebanon because Hezbollah keeps trying to interpolate its own forces into southern Lebanon. So, I think that what you'll end up with is sort of a grinding new status quo in the Gaza Strip is the most likely scenario. And as far as, the possibility of refugees in Gaza leaving the Gaza Strip. If they want to go, it's bizarrely non-humanitarian to tell people they have to stay in an area that literally has no livable running water or homes. And that's the fault of Hamas. But I mean, what exactly is the alternative? You leave 2 million people in an area that is going to be rubble for the next 20 years? The entire area is rubble. And by the way, it should be rubble because Hamas turned the entire place into a terrorist base. You turn terrorist bases into rubble. And so, if people want to leave and they want to go to Egypt or Qatar, I think it says a lot about Egypt and Qatar that they're perfectly willing to keep them in these supposedly inhumanitarian conditions rather than letting them into Egypt or Qatar or Jordan or anywhere else.
We're not speaking about that nearly enough. The fact that, during the Holocaust, the huge criticism that countries were unwilling to take Jewish refugees in. And now you have these refugees from Gaza. And the fact that Egypt and Jordan, countries America is giving a tremendous amount of aid to, are turning away refugees. They're not willing to take them in. There is
President Trump's is saying it, right? President Trump is saying this stuff out loud, and he should be saying this stuff out loud. I mean, the reality is, forget about taking refugees. Egypt has had the most solid border of Gaza is the border with Egypt. By far. It was much more solid than the border, as it turns out, that Israel had with the Gaza Strip prior to October 7th. Egypt's border had triple barbed wire fences and these massive impediments. And by the way, there's nothing on the other side of that border in Egypt. It's not as though there are gigantic settlements on the other side of that border. It's not like a Gaza envelope that's heavily lived in. Is not a bunch of Moshavim over there. There's nothing. It's a desert, and they still wouldn't let them in. And the reason they wouldn't let them in is because what everybody knows in the Middle East, but nobody's willing to say out loud, is that the Palestinian population is deeply radicalized. That they have heavy sympathy for terrorism, and everywhere a heavy Palestinian population goes, unfortunately, instability follows, and that's true from Jordan to Lebanon to what presumably would be Egypt. It was true in Kuwait. Kuwait expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians after the first Gulf War. And this is a major intractable problem. And again, acknowledging that would at least be an honest way of going about the issue.
It's such a critical point you're making because as Jews, we naturally have opinions about everything. And a lot of people are pontificating and sharing their opinions about this ceasefire and about the deal. We should have the humility to say also that there's so much we don't know. I mean, we didn't know at the time the deal was announced that President Trump was going to be talking to other countries about taking in Palestinians from Gaza. Might that have changed the equation? It might have. There are other things that we don't know. The fact that he's going to declare the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. We don't know what was whispered when pressure was put to bear and what else was included in it. So at least we should have humility with these opinions. Mr. Shapiro, none of this appears in the musical. A musical is intentionally apolitical and an excellent job of being apolitical. Why was that important for you to be apolitical? October 7th was political in some ways, right? It was the result of some poor decisions and some poor leadership. And yet you've been very focused on it being something which is apolitical and something that resonates for all. Why was that important to you and how did you achieve that?
Well, I think that the best way you remain apolitical is to be selfless. And this was really this project was something that Ben and I really, we never wanted anything from it other than to get up and to be able to be seen, any successes in God's hands. So I think when you're selfless, you tend to be apolitical. I think that's actually the problem with Jewish people anyway. I think that all the divisiveness always comes from, my wife we had this discussion once, and we were asking why people do what they do. And she quoted all the president's men and said, follow the money. And I said, in all cases, it's follow the ego. It's always follow the sense of self. And when this sounds like a digression, but it really isn't. It's vital, I think, for all of us as Jews to put our egos aside. It's a very difficult thing for people to do, and it creates a lot of trouble. But I think when you do, Ben and I were just trying to give a message of higher import, that as a matter of fact, one of the remarkable things about this musical was the conductor and director, whom I did not know before we did this, were absolutely selfless. And so the people who worked on it, everybody, just couldn't wait to work on it. And they couldn't, nobody was interested in their own self-aggrandizement. It was a remarkable thing. I've not had that experience before.
Is the diversity among the orchestra? Is the diversity among the audience? Have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, there were black hat people there. There were people, the Hiloni people there. There's a couple guys in the orchestra who are, wearing kippot. There, I think it really crossed all boundaries because that's really what the musical is about: is crossing all boundaries. For all of us, and to be one. I think when you want to be one, you're on a higher mission than politics, actually.
You talked about what it was like with Ben sitting to your right at the Shabbos table at a young age. You basically had a sponge sitting on your right who was soaking everything up.
That's right.
I'll embarrass Barry a little bit, but at what age did you realize that Ben was not an ordinary child in terms of his capacity to pick up information? And
We've joked about this before. A couple quick stories. When he was a C-section baby, as were our girls after him. And so when we brought him home, he was 3 days old. We put him in a little rocker on the dining room table, and he was staring up at the light above it. And I had 3 nephews who were also very, very bright, who were also older. But he was staring at it with such a focus. And I turned to my wife and I said, well, either he's brain damaged or he's a genius. I'm not sure which. And as Ben and I have often joked, the jury's still out. But then it was just, he was completely rational from the time he was little, which is not my stock and trade. I tend to get really impassioned and, very emotional about things. And I think Ben was just made of different material. And so, which is something I could appreciate because, my wife's constantly trying to hang on to my suspenders as I go diving off the cliff. But Ben was not like that. And so, there's a real, I'm going to embarrass him, but there was a real humility about gathering knowledge. It's funny. I've said to people, Ben always reminds himself he's not the smartest person in the room because he reads, 3 books a week or something. And when he's reading a book, that person, on a nonfiction subject, for example, that person is almost by definition more expert in that subject than he is. So he's essentially talking to somebody who's smarter. And he's imbibing all that knowledge, but it's a constant reminder of your own humility, that you don't know things. And I value that so highly. The people in my life that I want in my life are people who demonstrate genuine humility. And that's pretty critical. And I think that's what we need as a people. Just if everybody, could emulate Moshe, the Ananav, and just put your ego aside, I think we'd be just fine.
Ben, do you remember what age when you looked at your classmates and said, I'm picking this information up, or I'm a little bit ahead, or I'm reading a little faster, or something's a little bit different here? And how did you process that?
Honestly, because I was reading very, very young. So I knew from when I was very young that I was smart, but I also had the privilege of going to, at the age of maybe 10 or 11, I went to a magnet school, and you had to have an IQ test to get into this magnet school. And you had to have a very high IQ to get in, but there were kids that had way higher IQs than I did at this particular magnet school in LA. There was a kid in the 7th grade. There's a girl in the class who was doing top level college calculus in 7th grade. And I remember talking to my dad about it. And one of the things he said was, listen, it's not about being the smartest person in the class, not about having just the raw IQ points. It's how hard you work. If you work really, you can work harder than anybody else in the class. You may not be the smartest person, but if you work the hardest, then you'll end up in the best place. And so that had been something that had been repeatedly told to me, actually, from the time I was young, whether it was my parents, whether it was some teachers, was that, the sort of raw IQ points or the raw talents, all that stuff is raw. That's what it is. And it's good. You need it, but that's not sufficient. And I think that the danger, anytime you talk about talent level, is the assumption is that talent is enough, and talent is never enough. You can have the talent to be a really good musician, but if you don't put in literally tens of thousands of hours practicing at the thing, you're not going to be good at it. And the same thing, or at least good enough to actually be the best at it. And the same thing is true in literally any industry. I think there are 2 mistakes that get made, and they're sort of 2 halves of the same whole. One is people thinking that work alone without talent is going to do it. And it doesn't. There is such a thing as talent, and recognizing that is important. And so if you don't have a talent at a thing, no matter how much work you put into that thing, it just might not be your thing. But the other point is that talent alone isn't enough. And if you're a talented person in anything, you tend to think that everything is supposed to come really, really easily. And then when it doesn't come easily, then you get discouraged and you sort of fall apart. Again, one of the lessons that was drilled into me is that, no matter how talented you are, there will always be somebody out there. It's a big world. There'll always be somebody out there who's more talented at this thing, just on a raw talent level, than you are. Those are the odds, right? They're literally 1 in 8 billion odds that you are the most talented person at any given thing. And so if that's the case, then the only thing that is in your control is how hard you work for the thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a funny story. Some years ago, Ben was interviewed on C-SPAN, and it was a great interview. It was about a 3-hour interview. And at one point, the interviewer asked him, so what's the smartest thing anyone ever said to you? So, we've always been so close. So I was waiting, come on, tell him what your father said. And Ben said, well, my third grade teacher. I went, what? And he's my third grade teacher. He was right, of course. He said, my third grade teacher told me, don't let potential be written on your tombstone. And I remember watching, thinking, okay, he's right. That was the smartest thing anybody said to him, and it wasn't for me. But it's something I think everybody can take to heart. Just work as hard as you can and see what happens.
I think it's a lesson for every industry. People in Torah, they look at Gedol and they look at super geniuses in Torah, and they think, well, they're just genius. My Rabbi Rav Shechter, he's just a super genius. He knows everything. He wasn't born knowing everything. Like you say, he had the raw talent, and then there's the hasmada, there's the work that goes with it. People don't want to put in, they don't want to take that time to be able to put in the work. Ben, have you ever looked your classmates in that school with the higher IQs? Did they make anything of themselves? I'm sure there are, in fact, people who failed flat on their face because they didn't have.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of failures to launch. I've never really looked back at like everybody who's in the class. I'm sure some people, did okay. But I knew at the time, there's a bunch of smart kids. And if you were misdirected, I remember telling my parents, like 1/3 of these kids are going to end up in prison. And there are definitely a couple who ended up in prison. It turns out that when you're, all talents can also be misdirected. They can be directed in I think the single most important thing that we have lost as a civilization is a very Torah ideal, which is that it's in your hands, right? It's up to you to do the thing. I think that as a civilization, we've been told that there are 1,000 reasons why, no matter how hard you work, no matter what you do, that society is stacked against you. And really what's wrong is the systems are broken. If the systems just weren't so broken, then you'd really succeed. Somebody's out there to harm you. Okay, the reality of life is no one cares about you. It's not just that I don't care about you. No one cares about you, okay? In real life, the number of people who care deeply about you as a human being is relegated generally to your immediate family, maybe a couple of close friends. That's it. Nobody else is spending their time thinking about you, which means that's both a sad thing to think about, and it's also a really good thing because it means nobody's standing in your way. Like, go out and actually do the thing. And I think that as a society, we've spent an awful lot of time focusing on reasons other than ourselves for our failures. And once you do that, politically, you end up in a road of conspiratorialism and very often in anti-Semitism. But I think that, on a personal level, where you really end up is failure. If the mark of every successful person that I've ever met is that when they fail, their first reaction is, what did I do wrong that I won't do wrong next time? And the mark of every person I've met who has not been as successful as they want to be is they think about all the reasons, all the external factors to them that are the reasons for their lack of success. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't external reasons for lack of success. There are tons of things in the world that go wrong. There's luck. There are people who don't like you from time to time. I've dealt with some of that too. But if your immediate reaction is to look, the sort of dichotomy that's been put out there before in a book called The Great is sort of the window versus the mirror. If you're a person who has a problem and you look outside the window for the reason for the problem and something else, then you're probably not going to succeed. If you're a person who has a problem and the first thing you do is look in a mirror, then at least you can correct the things you can correct, because you can't control the things outside the window anyway. All you can control is the thing in the mirror.
On the way to the Mizbeach, on the way to the altar in the temple, was the kior, but the base was made out of a mirror. And a lot of reasons are given. The women beautified themselves in those mirrors when they were in Egypt. They had a lot of faith and optimism. They thought the world was yet worth bringing people into. But Rabbi Soloveitchik says one of the reasons is the mirror, because before you walk up to the altar and ask for atonement or forgiveness, you got to look in the mirror and take responsibility. And that notion of the mirror was implicit in the temple. You got to look in the mirror before you offer the sacrifice, before you seek the atonement, before you get the forgiveness, before you get the pass, before you get to just go. You got to look in the mirror and see what's your role in it. So I will say, Mr. Shapiro, you say that your secret is that you married well. Ben also married very well, and I know that his wife keeps him incredibly grounded and humble, which is tremendous. But seeing the relationship between the two of you, as I said, is very special. Rabbi Wein, he should be well, said one of the greatnesses of Rashi is that he raised children and grandchildren with the confidence to disagree with him, but also admire and revere and respect him. Like Rabbeinu Tam wore different tefillin than his grandfather Rashi. Rabbeinu Tam looked at his grandfather Rashi and said, Zeta, you've never been Yotzei tefillin in your life. You've never fulfilled the mitzvah of tefillin. I got the order right. You got the order wrong. And yet, he revered, admired, and loved. So to have that relationship with future generations, that they can simultaneously be independent thinkers and be willing to debate and disagree, and yet revere and admire. I know the reverence and the admiration, the love that you have for each other, and it really is a model and something very special to see. And it's realized in this collaboration of this musical. So here's the big question: is the musical coming to America? Is it coming to Florida? Everyone who's just listened and heard all about it and heard the reviews from the people in Israel, where can they find it?
And so we're working on that right now, actually. So there's a cast album that's being put together, and that's in Hebrew. It was originally written in English. It was translated into Hebrew in order to play in Israel. We are working on bringing it to Florida. We want to play it here. We want to play it in the original language in which it was written, because I think, frankly, the lyrics are going to be better in the original language in which it was written. But keep an eye on spaces like this one, and I'm sure that you'll know about it in short order.
Fantastic. Mr. Shapiro, Ben, thank you for going behind the Bima, sharing a little bit about this. And as I say, really to both of you, in front of the scenes and behind the scenes, all that you're doing, it's never taken for granted. It is deeply, deeply appreciated, I know, by me, by our community, by the Jewish people everywhere. And Hashem, God should continue to give you the strength and the wisdom and the confidence and the clarity to stand up for our people, to stand up for Israel, stand up for truth, and to be successful in all of your efforts. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Catch us next time for another peek behind the Bima.